Hello, my name is Elisha Tucker. I'm the Director of Education for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of Cincinnati, which promotes knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence. And our guest today is Maya Jasanoff. She's the Coolidge Professor of History at Harvard University, and she specializes in the history of the British Empire. And she's here today to talk about the global migration of Loyalists after the American War of Independence, which is the subject of her second book, Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World. And it's the first global history of the Loyalist diaspora after the Revolutionary War, and we're glad that she's here to talk about Loyalists, which are often not talked about when studying the Revolution, and also to give a global perspective to our national story. So to start us off, would you tell us what is a Loyalist and what did they want for America and the British Empire?
Sure. I think that when people look at Loyalists in the American Revolution, they often find the position of Loyalists really puzzling. Loyalists were people who didn't want independence from the British Empire. They wanted to keep King George III as their king, and they wanted to retain all of the connections of trade and friendship and relationships and kinship and religion that had tied the colonies to Britain for so long. But I think that there's a slight backwards-forwards way in which people tend to approach this question. Because the truth of the matter is that the Loyalist position going into the Revolutionary War was not the weird position. We look at them now as strange, but in fact, it was the rebels who were strange. The rebels were the weird people who actually wanted to break all of the ties. They were the ones who said, hey, we're going to reinvent things. We're going to get rid of the king. We're going to get rid of the empire. We're going to strike out on our own. And that's the position that you really have to look at with the question mark over it, not the Loyalist position.
So who would make your short list of Loyalists to know during that time?
So I think that there are a lot of people who could make the short list, and part of the reason is that there's a very long list to choose from. And one thing that I want to make clear is that when we talk about loyalism, we're actually talking about a really high percentage of the population of the American colonies. We're talking about approximately 1 in 3 members of the population in 1775 who remain loyal to the king. So there's a lot of people to choose from. This is not a tiny little fringe group on the edges. But out of that group of about 1 in 3 Americans, I would want to pick a few people who seem to me to represent the range of Loyalist positions. Loyalism was an idea, a set of ideas, a set of beliefs and practices and customs and culture that spanned the entire ethnic and geographic and religious spectrum of early America. So I would pick out probably 3 figures. One would be an example of a white Loyalist with some ties to Britain and to Europe, the kind of person who you might, on the face of things, expect to be loyal. This is a woman whose name was Elizabeth Lichtenstein. She was born in Georgia in the 1760s. Her father was a servant of the colonial government in Georgia. He had a job with them. And so, as I say, these are people who had some kind of connection to the British government, some kind of connection to Europe. John Lichtenstein himself had been an immigrant into the colonies. And yet, by picking Elizabeth Lichtenstein as one of my shortlisted Loyalists, one of the things I want to point out to people is that, you know, we're talking about women. We're talking about also someone who was really young at the time the war started. She was a teenager at most when the war began, sort of 12 years old. And she was really brought into the war through the affiliations of her parents, her father in particular. And yet she ended up growing up between 1775 and 1783. This covered the entirety of what would today be, let's say, middle school and high school for somebody. This is a girl who's basically caught on the front lines of this war. And she's a Loyalist because, in part, her father has remained loyal, and they feel like they have more to lose by joining the rebels, but she ends up paying the price that a lot of Loyalists do in defeat. So Elizabeth Lichtenstein would be one of my shortlisted Loyalists. Let me mention a couple of others who I think represent different faces of loyalism at this time. One of them would be the Loyalist David George. David George was born into slavery. He was born into slavery in the American South in the 1740s, and he, like many African Americans held in slavery at the time of the American Revolution, didn't feel like he had a lot of reason to support his white masters who were rebelling against Britain. And when British governors and British generals came into the South and into the slave-owning communities of the South, and they offered to African Americans the possibility of becoming free if those slaves came to join British forces, that looked like a pretty good bet to David George. And he was one of tens of thousands of African American slaves, including slaves belonging to Thomas Jefferson, slaves belonging to George Washington, for whom the promises of freedom held out by the British were way more compelling than the ideas of liberty championed by their former owners.
And that's known as Dunmore's Proclamation.
Yes, so the initial offer of freedom given to black loyalists was issued very early in the conflict by the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. It's called Dunmore's Proclamation, and you can read it, and it's a very interesting document to take a look at. The recruitment of slaves into the British Army began right at the beginning of the war. The third Loyalist that I would shortlist also represents another of these faces of loyalism, and that belongs to a fellow that we know by the name of Joseph Brant. Joseph Brant was a Mohawk Indian living in upstate New York on Mohawk land. His elder sister, Molly, had been for many, many years in a relationship with the Irish-born superintendent of Indian Affairs in upstate New York, a man called William Johnson. And Joseph Brant had thus been raised in a kind of extended family and a household in which there was a close alliance between the British and between the Mohawk Indians, who indeed had various kinds of treaties of alliance with the British. And so when the war started, for Joseph Brant, as for many Indians in the future United States, again, the choice seemed fairly clear what to do. The choice was either to stay with the people with whom they had long been allied, the British, or to join the people who they knew best as settlers who really wanted to take their land. And so again, for Indians, the Mohawks in the north, the Creek in the south, the choice to remain with the British seemed pretty self-evident.
I think that really changes the perspective for a lot of people of that it wasn't just whites that were going back to England, but there were a large diversity among the Loyalists. So when Loyalists were moving or after the war and they were either deciding to stay or to migrate elsewhere, what were some of the factors that they considered?
During the American Revolution, there was a huge amount of movement and migration within the colonies. This is something that we don't hear very much about, but it's something that may be familiar to us today if we just watch the news and we see different war-torn situations like Syria. There's a huge amount of migration going on within the colonies at the time of the war, with tens of thousands of Loyalists going into the cities that are held by the British during the war. Those cities are primarily Charleston, Savannah, and New York City. And at the end of the war, in 1781, the year of Yorktown, and then through to 1783, the year of the peace treaty, these Loyalists living in the British-held cities are really questioning their possible futures in the United States. The British are going to evacuate, and the Loyalists who have been living under British protection are worried about what is going to become of them. So one of the sets of factors that they consider are what you might call push factors, the kinds of reasons that make people choose to leave their homes. The push factors include the possibility of recriminations and retaliations that they fear if they go back to the communities that they had left. They're afraid that the people who were on the other side of the war are now going to take it out on them in possibly violent ways. Other factors that they think about are what has happened to their property in their absence. Many Loyalists, particularly after 1776, faced the confiscation of their land under acts by new colonial legislatures, new state legislatures. And of course, when many of these people had left their hometowns and gone into places like New York and Charleston, they left behind their property. And so they had no idea whether they would have anything really to go home to. So those are some of the factors that made them maybe reluctant to go home. There was another set of factors, though, that Loyalists considered at the end of the war, and that was what we would call pull factors, the kinds of reasons that people choose, for positive reasons, to go somewhere else, the attractions of going somewhere else. At the end of the war, the British, as they were leaving these cities, felt a certain sense of responsibility to the Loyalist civilians who had moved into the cities to live under their protection. And so at the end of the war, the British decided not only to evacuate British troops and British military supplies and British government apparatus that was, of course, no longer relevant in the new United States, they also decided to hold out the opportunity to any Loyalist civilians to go with them into other parts of the British Empire if those Loyalists wanted to do so. And what was more, they said to those Loyalists, well, if you come with us, of course, you'll remain British subjects and you'll remain part of the British Empire and you'll remain ruled by King George III, but we'll actually give you a little bit more because we know that you're giving up your homes and you're giving up your property and you're giving up all the ties that you used to have. So if you go with us, we'll give you new things to help you get settled somewhere else. We'll give you land grants, which the British offered to Loyalists in particular in Canada and in the Bahamas. We'll give you food and clothes to get you through the immediate short term, especially when you're going into climates that are unfamiliar to you. We'll give you seeds to plant in the ground. We'll give you farm implements to help you cultivate these new crops. And we'll even give you, they decided, some kind of compensation for the property that you've lost. And in London, a group was formed in Parliament called the Loyalist Claims Commission, where these Loyalists who had lost property during the war could file petitions, basically, file claims asking to get some kind of compensation from the government. So the whole thing really represents one of the first interventions that I know of by a state in what we would today call refugee relief or humanitarian relief. And it's really, really interesting that this is one of the consequences of the American Revolution.
Interesting. So when they did migrate, what locations did they end up in?
The Loyalist migrants overwhelmingly resettled in different parts of the British Empire around the Atlantic. And that was primarily for reasons of proximity, and it was also for reasons of relative familiarity. So there were really two huge directions in which Loyalists went. One of them was to the north, to the provinces of Canada, in particular Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. These were areas that were, of course, geographically contiguous to New England, New York State, and they were tied to those regions in all kinds of ways, culturally and climatically and so on. And so many Loyalists ended up going to those provinces, so many, in fact, that the whole kind of nature of government in Canada was reshaped to accommodate them. Another big movement of Loyalists, though, went to the south, and this concerned people mostly coming from the southern colonies who had been, in some cases, slave owners or involved in plantation communities. And these people wanted mostly to try to go to other parts of the British Empire where they could also have similar kinds of lives, in particular where they could have lives where they would still own and use slaves. And so these Loyalists tended to go to the British Caribbean, to Jamaica, which was at the time the most prosperous colony in the British Empire, and also to the Bahamas, which are not technically in the Caribbean, but are, of course, warm islands down in the seas off of Florida, and were places that had a lot of available land at the time. They weren't heavily settled, and where Loyalists were encouraged to resettle with their slaves. So those are the two major places that Loyalists go, but I want to highlight two others. One is, of course, Britain itself. And I think a lot of the time when people think about Loyalists, they think, oh, well, they were basically English, and of course they would just go back to England.
Which is what I thought before I read your book.
You're not alone. Many people think this. And yet, most Loyalists were, like most Americans, people who had never been to England. They were people who were born in the now United States. They were people who had never been to England in their lives in many cases. And so some of them did go to England. Some of those who went to England in particular were ones who went very early in the war, ones who had closer ties to England, ones who had more money because England was an expensive place to go. But for most of those people who went to England, and it was a limited number, it wasn't going back to England, it was going to England for the first time. And they found it to be just as foreign a place as most Americans would find today. I mean, they speak English and there are certain kinds of affinities, but it is a foreign country. The second other place that I'd like to mention that Loyalists go brings us back to the figure of David George, whom I mentioned earlier. The Black Loyalists, as these former slaves were called, faced a particular set of issues as they left the now United States. And that was that, of course, they had been raised in slavery, and they were now in a position of freedom. But they were in a position of freedom in a world in which slavery was still quite widespread. Slavery was still practiced, of course, in Jamaica, among other places. Slavery had only very, very recently become kind of technically illegal in England itself. So these are people who have recently arrived into freedom in societies that are not used to having large numbers of free blacks. And they go in the first instance to Canada, but they find that their life there is rather difficult. It's strange, it's cold, it's very unfamiliar to them. The people that they live amongst, the whites among whom they live, are not very interested in extending to them different kinds of privileges. And it's for that reason that in 1791, a group of 1,200 black loyalists, including and led by David George, end up going to yet a different place in the Loyalist diaspora. And that place is the country of Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. And with the support of a group of British abolitionists, this cluster of black loyalists crosses the Atlantic from Canada to settle the city of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And Freetown takes its name from the freedom that they implanted there. Freetown, it was their Freetown, founded by or settled by black loyalists.
So this next one would make a good essay question. What were the international consequences of the Loyalist exodus after the American War of Independence?
I see the American Loyalist exodus as really significant for the international history of this period. It's a period that's called the Age of Revolutions by many historians, and they say the Age of Revolutions because the American Revolution was the first of several revolutions that soon followed. The French Revolution, very soon thereafter, with many ties, of course, to America, with figures like the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to fight in America and was then involved in revolutionary France not long thereafter. The revolution in Haiti, which led to the independence and abolition of slavery in Haiti, various revolutions in Latin America. So this is a period where there are lots of revolutions, following the example of the United States. But by tracing the line of the Loyalists out of the US, I think we see a different side of the Age of Revolutions. And that's the side of the Age of Revolutions which actually didn't become revolutionary. That's the side that's actually kind of like Britain itself, where there was no revolution. George III was not overthrown within Britain. And in fact, in the huge series of battles and wars that Britain went on to fight with revolutionary France in the 1790s and early part of the 19th century, ultimately it would be the British Empire that came out victorious from this whole set of conflicts. So I think that we see in the British response to the Loyalists after the American Revolution, and in the British response to the loss in America, several ingredients of a kind of new formula for Britain in the world and the British Empire in the world that will be really significant for the history of the Age of Revolutions. And those include a few principles, which together I call the spirit of 1783. We're really used to the spirit of 1776 with, liberty and equality and the pursuit of happiness. The spirit of 1783, as I see it, has these other elements. One of them is that the British become really committed to actual territorial expansion. They expand the British Empire. They expand it in Canada, they expand it in the Bahamas, they expand it in Sierra Leone, they expand it in all these places that the Loyalist refugees are very usefully settling for them. But they expanded in other places too. They expanded, for example, in the 1780s into Australia, which becomes part of the British Empire. They expand their role and their presence in India, which will become the real center of the British Empire in the decades ahead. And they pursue this sense of expansion with a real kind of commitment to the idea that in these British domains, a couple of kinds of principles will be in the forefront. And these are the other two elements of the spirit of 1783. One of them is that the British say, look, you guys in America, for example, you former colonists, now you call yourselves members of the United States, you guys thought that you were going to be equal to us. Well, guess what? That's not going to work in the British Empire. We're not going to say that everyone in India and everyone in Africa and everyone in Canada and everyone in Jamaica and Australia, we're not going to say that all of you guys are exactly the same as the British living in Britain. But we are going to say this to you. We are going to say to you that you can have certain rights. You can have protection. You can have the freedom to protest certain kinds of things that you don't like. You can protest by writing a petition to the king, for example. The king is going to protect you, and the king is there for you. You can have security of your property. You can have relative freedom from arbitrary arrest. You can have, by and large, in many places, some kind of local government and some sense of fair justice, jury, trial by your peers, that kind of thing. You will get all of those sorts of protections in the British Empire, but you will get them without being our equals. And so in this we see these two things. We see on the one hand a kind of commitment to a vision of liberty that the British are giving to their subjects. But we also see in this a kind of reassertion of a sort of hierarchy in which it is made very clear that the king is on the top, Parliament is in Britain, and the colonies are going to have to follow the lead of what London dictates.
For our final question, there's a portrait in 1812 that Benjamin West created, and would you unpack it for us?
Sure. So this is a really fascinating picture. It's, as you can tell from the image, it's really a picture within a picture. So let me first tell you about the picture on the outside to give you a little bit of context. This is a painting of a fellow called John Eardley Wilmot. And John Eardley Wilmot was a member of Parliament. And as a member of Parliament, he became the person in charge of the Loyalist Claims Commission, that entity that was set up in order to give some of these refugee loyalists compensation for the property that they had lost. The painting of Wilmot was done by the artist Benjamin West, who was one of the most famous painters of this period. He was a huge favorite of King George III, who commissioned West to paint all kinds of scenes from British history and paintings of the royal family. But Benjamin West was himself actually an American. He was born in Pennsylvania and had emigrated to Britain in his early adulthood. So that's the picture on the outside, is Eardley Wilmot, as portrayed by Benjamin West. The picture on the inside actually comes from a study that West had begun probably many years earlier, around the time of the end of the American Revolution in 1783. And it has a title which I think is really a phrase that captures exactly what Britain was doing at the end of the American Revolution with respect to the Loyalists. It's called The Reception of the American Loyalists by Great Britain, and you see in it a series of allegories. In the top corner of the image, over on the right-hand side, you see the figure of Britannia. This is the British equivalent of, let's say, Lady Liberty, some kind of embodiment of what Britain is, and you can recognize her, among other things, by the shield that she has, which has the cross of St. George and the cross of St. Andrew, the kind of Union Jack on her shield. And she's stretching out her arm, which is, by the way, wearing armor. This is a very powerful Britannia. She's stretching out her arm over a whole group of Loyalist refugees. Who's among these Loyalist refugees? Well, we see all those different figures that I was talking to you about before. We see right up in the front various white Loyalists. Some of them are modeled on real figures. One of them, for example, is a Massachusetts Loyalist called William Pepperell. So these are some recognizable white Loyalists, men, kind of your stereotypical figure of a Loyalist. But if you then look behind, you see some of these other kinds of figures. You see, above all, a Native American Indian who's reaching his hand right back up to Britannia, and you could see in him a kind of allegory for a figure like Joseph Brant. Behind his other arm, the Native American Indian has standing next to him a woman wearing a black veil, implying that she's a widow from the war, so women and children behind her. And behind them, again, right on the other edge of the painting, there are a number of figures who are black, and these represent the black Loyalists, the former slaves who got their freedom from Britain. So this picture captures that sense of the diversity, the pluralism of Loyalism, and the sense that the British Empire was going to protect all of these people. It didn't matter what your skin color was, didn't matter what religion you were, didn't matter really how rich or poor you were, if you were married or not, you still got the protection of Britannia. But you got the protection with Britannia absolutely above you, and with the crown right here on the table that all of the Loyalists are sort of pointing toward, to remind you that this is an empire governed by Britain and governed by the king.
Thank you. That would be a really rich image to be able to explore in a classroom for students learning about the American Revolution and the side of the Loyalist in leaving the United States and being under the umbrella of the British Empire. So, Professor Jasanoff, thank you so much for coming and talking with us today and teaching us about the Loyalists.
Sure, thanks very much.